In 2001, a man was found dead in a quiet part of North Georgia, and almost nothing about his death made immediate sense. There were signs of violence, but no clear explanation. Evidence existed, but it could not yet speak clearly. Investigators worked with what they had, documented everything they could, and then reached a point where answers stopped forming. Years passed, then decades. The name Herman Wilder remained in official records, tied to unanswered responsibility and preserved material that waited without promise. What makes this story unusual is not only how long it remained unresolved, but how carefully it was kept intact while time moved on. This account follows what was known at the start and how uncertainty took hold long before resolution was possible. If you follow careful reporting that explains how investigations actually unfold, consider subscribing for future documentaries built on verified records. Herman Wilder was discovered deceased in Lumpkin County in 2001. Authorities were notified, and deputies responded to the location where his body was found. The surroundings indicated that the death involved violence rather than natural causes. Officers secured the area and began standard procedures to protect potential evidence. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, and initial observations documented before any items were removed. Investigators assessed visible injuries and the position of the body. These findings led them to classify the death as a criminal matter from the outset. The focus immediately shifted toward determining how Herman Wilder died and who might be responsible. At that point, little was known beyond the physical condition in which he was found. Personal identification was confirmed through official records. Investigators notified next of kin and began gathering background information that could help establish recent movements. This included reviewing where he lived, who he associated with, and when he was last seen alive. These steps were necessary to begin narrowing the time frame between last contact and discovery. Physical evidence was collected from the scene and surrounding area. Items were logged, packaged, and preserved according to procedure. Some materials were considered potentially significant due to their proximity to the body. Others were collected to rule out unrelated factors. At the time, investigators could not know which pieces might later matter. Forensic examination began with the tools available in 2001. Medical findings confirmed that Herman Wilder died as a result of violent injuries. This reinforced the direction of the investigation and ruled out accidental causes. However, forensic testing options were limited. DNA analysis existed, but it required samples of sufficient quality that were not always recoverable from outdoor environments. Investigators canvassed the area and spoke with individuals who might have information. They reviewed known contacts and attempted to reconstruct recent activity. These efforts produced fragments rather than a clear path forward. No immediate suspect emerged, and no witness provided information that could be independently confirmed. Law enforcement reviewed records for prior incidents that might be relevant. This included checking for disputes, prior reports, or known threats. These reviews did not establish responsibility. Without corroboration, investigators avoided drawing conclusions that could not be supported by evidence. As days turned into weeks, the investigation continued, but progress slowed. Leads were examined and set aside when they could not be verified. The absence of a clear suspect meant that attention remained on evidence already collected. Deputies ensured that materials were properly stored and that documentation remained complete. What remained at the end of the initial response was a carefully recorded investigation without resolution. Herman Wilder's death entered official files as an unresolved violent killing. Evidence had been preserved, reports completed, and procedures followed. What was missing was the information needed to move forward. At that point, the outcome depended not on effort, but on developments that had not yet arrived. After the discovery of Herman Wilder, investigators turned from documentation toward reconstruction. The immediate task was to determine what could be known about his final days using records, verified observations, and traceable information. This work unfolded methodically, guided by procedure rather than urgency. Deputies began by establishing a narrow window of time between when Herman Wilder was last confirmed alive and when his body was found. This involved reviewing phone records where available, checking known routines, and confirming recent sightings through documented sources. The aim was not to create a story, but to anchor the investigation within a defensible sequence supported by evidence. Attention shifted to his immediate environment. Investigators examined where he lived, how he spent his time, and who he had regular contact with. These steps relied on existing records and confirmed associations rather than assumption. Each name that appeared in the process was treated as a point of inquiry, not implication. Interviews were conducted and recorded, with statements evaluated for consistency rather than narrative fit. Physical movement became another focus. Deputies reviewed routes Herman Wilder was known to travel, places he was documented to visit, and areas connected to his daily life. This geographic review helped investigators understand how he might have arrived at the location where he was found. It also identified areas where witnesses might reasonably exist, even if none had yet come forward. Investigators also reviewed prior interactions involving Herman Wilder that had been documented by law enforcement. These records were examined to identify patterns or conflicts that could be relevant. The review did not produce a direct line to responsibility, but it provided context that helped rule out certain explanations while leaving others unresolved. Evidence collected from the discovery site was assessed alongside this background work. Items were evaluated not only for forensic potential, but for how they fit within known facts. The condition and placement of materials were considered carefully. Investigators avoided drawing conclusions from proximity alone, aware that outdoor environments often contain unrelated objects. Community outreach formed part of the early effort. Law enforcement encouraged information from anyone who might have seen or interacted with Herman Wilder shortly before his death. Tips were received and documented. Each was evaluated against known facts. Some lacked detail, others could not be corroborated. None provided a verifiable path forward. As days passed, the investigation expanded outward without losing focus. Deputies compared the circumstances of Herman Wilder's death with other unresolved violent incidents in the region. This comparison was limited to factual similarities rather than speculative linkage. No confirmed connection emerged, and the inquiry remained centered on evidence specific to this death. Throughout this period, investigators balanced persistence with restraint. Leads were followed when supported by information, and set aside when they failed verification. This process reflected an understanding that premature conclusions could compromise both accuracy and credibility. The absence of a clear suspect did not alter the standards applied. Supervisors reviewed progress regularly. Reports were examined for completeness. Evidence logs were checked for accuracy. These internal reviews ensured that early work met procedural requirements and that no foundational step had been overlooked. The emphasis remained on building a reliable record rather than producing quick results. Despite sustained effort, the investigation reached a familiar point faced by many inquiries from that era. The available information did not converge into a single accountable individual. Witness accounts lacked confirmation. Forensic testing could not yet provide clarity. Background reviews offered context without resolution. What remained after this early focus was a carefully assembled framework. The facts had been gathered, preserved, and evaluated within the limits of the time. Investigators had defined what was known and, just as importantly, what could not yet be established. The work did not fail. It reached the boundary imposed by evidence and technology. As momentum slowed, attention returned to preservation. Materials were secured. Records were finalized. The investigation remained open, though active direction narrowed. The early focus had shaped the file that would endure, carrying forward not answers, but a disciplined account of what had been done and what remained unresolved. What remained after the initial investigative push was not a conclusion, but a collection of material facts. Objects gathered from the location where Herman Wilder was found became the center of continued attention. Each item had been collected with care, logged, and stored according to procedure. At that stage, their value was uncertain, not because they lacked importance, but because their meaning could not yet be fully interpreted. Investigators revisited the physical material repeatedly during the early months. They reviewed how each object had been found, where it was positioned, and how it related to the documented condition of the body. Outdoor environments introduce complexity. Items can be displaced by weather, animals, or unrelated human activity. For that reason, proximity alone was not treated as explanation. Everything was assessed conservatively. Medical findings confirmed that Herman Wilder had suffered fatal injuries consistent with a violent assault. This established direction, but it did not provide identity. Attention returned to whether biological material could connect the injuries to a specific individual. At the time, DNA testing existed, but it required samples that were relatively intact and uncontaminated. Many forms of trace evidence did not meet those standards, especially when exposed to the elements. Forensic personnel attempted testing where appropriate. Samples were examined, documented, and evaluated. Some produced inconclusive results. Others failed to yield usable information altogether. These outcomes were recorded without embellishment. A lack of results did not invalidate the evidence, but it did limit what could be done with it. Investigators understood that science sets boundaries as much as it provides answers. In 2001, forensic methods could confirm cause of death and rule out certain scenarios, but they could not always identify who was responsible. This reality shaped how evidence was treated. Rather than exhausting or discarding material, authorities focused on preservation. Storage conditions mattered. Items were sealed to prevent contamination and degradation. Chain of custody records were maintained to ensure integrity. Each transfer, review, or examination was logged. These steps were not dramatic, but they were essential. Evidence that cannot be accounted for loses value, regardless of what it might contain. Alongside physical material, written documentation accumulated. Scene photographs, medical reports, and laboratory notes were filed together. These records provided context that physical objects alone could not supply. Without them, later analysis would lack reference points needed to draw responsible conclusions. Investigators also considered what the evidence did not show. No clear weapon was identified. No biological profile emerged that could be compared against databases of the time. These absences were noted carefully. Recognizing limits prevented investigators from filling gaps with assumption. As months passed, routine reviews confirmed that no new forensic options were available. Technology had not yet reached a point where degraded or minimal samples could be reliably analyzed. This did not mean progress had stopped entirely. It meant that progress depended on future developments rather than immediate action. The decision to retain all material reflected an understanding that science evolves. What could not be examined effectively in 2001 might be interpretable later. Preserving evidence kept that possibility open. This choice required discipline and patience, especially as public attention faded and investigative activity slowed. For Herman Wilder's death, the physical evidence became a silent record. It neither accused nor exonerated. It existed as potential, defined by careful handling rather than immediate clarity. Investigators recognized that responsibility could not be assigned without proof that met legal standards. By the end of this period, the investigation rested on what had been done rather than what had been resolved. Evidence was preserved, records were complete, forensic limits were acknowledged without apology. What remained was an unresolved violent death supported by intact material and accurate documentation, waiting for tools that did not yet exist. The work did not stop abruptly. It narrowed. After the initial months, investigators found themselves returning to the same material with fewer new angles available. Reports were reread. Evidence logs were checked. Laboratory findings were reviewed again to confirm that nothing had been missed. Each review led to the same conclusion. The information on hand had already been fully examined within the limits of the time. Leads that once appeared promising lost momentum when they could not be supported. Some accounts lacked consistency. Others could not be verified through records or additional witnesses. Investigators documented these outcomes carefully, understanding that unsupported direction could introduce error rather than clarity. Closing a lead did not mean dismissing it casually. It meant recording why it could not move forward. As investigative options diminished, responsibility shifted toward maintenance. Evidence storage became a priority rather than an afterthought. Items collected earlier were audited to confirm condition and custody. Documentation was checked for completeness and accuracy. These steps ensured that the work already done would remain reliable if reviewed later. Public visibility declined as well. Without developments to report, attention moved elsewhere. This change did not alter the obligation held by law enforcement, but it changed the environment in which the work continued. Tips became infrequent. New information was rare. What remained was an unresolved death carried forward quietly rather than actively pursued. Supervisors evaluated whether additional resources could change the outcome. They considered whether new personnel or different approaches might uncover overlooked details. These evaluations did not identify gaps. The investigation had followed standard procedure, and the lack of resolution reflected evidentiary limits rather than oversight. Administrative classification followed. The investigation was designated inactive, a status that reflected reduced activity rather than closure. This designation allowed resources to be directed elsewhere while preserving the ability to resume work if new information emerged. Records remained accessible. Evidence remained secured. Responsibility remained assigned. Periodic review continued, even without progress. When personnel changed, files were examined to ensure continuity. This prevented reliance on memory and preserved institutional understanding. The written record became the primary means through which the investigation endured. The absence of a named suspect did not change how the death was regarded internally. It remained a violent killing without accountability. That reality shaped how investigators spoke about it and how they handled material connected to it. Caution replaced urgency. Precision replaced movement. Forensic limitations remained the defining constraint. Testing available at the time had reached its limit. Without new methods, further analysis could not produce additional information. Investigators understood that revisiting evidence prematurely could compromise future possibilities. Preservation became a strategic choice rather than a passive one. Time passed without altering the facts. The body had been found. The cause of death had been established. Evidence had been collected and stored. Interviews had been conducted and evaluated. Nothing new had entered the record. This stability did not resolve responsibility, but it ensured that what was known remained intact. By the end of this period, the investigation existed in a suspended state, not closed, not active, but held. Its continuity depended on records, preserved material, and the possibility that tools unavailable in 2001 might one day change what could be examined. Until then, the work remained defined by restraint, accuracy, and an acceptance of limits that could not yet be overcome. With active effort reduced, the investigation settled into a long stretch defined by care rather than pursuit. The focus turned fully toward preservation. What had been collected in the early years was now treated as a responsibility that extended forward, independent of momentum or attention. Evidence was no longer being gathered, it was being guarded. Physical material remained secured under controlled conditions. Items were stored in a manner intended to slow degradation and prevent contamination. Packaging was inspected periodically. Custody records were reviewed to confirm continuity. These actions were procedural, but they carried weight. Evidence that cannot be accounted for loses value regardless of what it might contain. Written records received similar attention. Reports, photographs, medical findings, and laboratory notes were maintained together to preserve context. Investigators understood that physical material without documentation could not be interpreted responsibly. The written record became the connective tissue that allowed preserved items to retain meaning over time. Responsibility for the investigation did not disappear as personnel changed. When deputies transferred or retired, files were reviewed by those who assumed oversight. This process reduced reliance on memory and ensured that understanding did not erode with staff turnover. Institutional knowledge was preserved through documentation rather than recollection. Periodic audits confirmed that materials remained intact. Supervisors checked storage conditions and verified that evidence matched inventory logs. These reviews did not generate progress, but they prevented loss. Quiet diligence replaced urgency as the defining characteristic of the work. Advances in forensic science were discussed broadly within law enforcement during these years, but they did not yet alter what could be done here. New techniques were emerging, but validation and access took time. Investigators monitored developments without acting prematurely. Preserving evidence ensured that when methods improved, material would still be available for examination. The decision to wait carried its own discipline. Testing that exhausts samples cannot be reversed. Investigators resisted the impulse to apply marginal techniques that might consume material without producing reliable results. Restraint protected future possibility. Public awareness remained limited. Without developments, attention stayed elsewhere. This absence of visibility did not lessen responsibility. It reinforced the need for accuracy. Errors made during quiet years would carry consequences if the investigation were later revisited. For Herman Wilder's death, preservation became the central act of investigation. It was not passive. It required ongoing attention, verification, and respect for procedure. Evidence was not treated as static. It was monitored, protected, and contextualized through maintained records. The passing years did not change the facts already established. They did, however, change the environment in which those facts existed. Science advanced elsewhere. Databases expanded. Methods improved incrementally. Each change increased the potential value of material that had been carefully retained. By maintaining evidence and records without compromise, investigators ensured that the unresolved nature of the death did not become permanent by default. Preservation kept the possibility of examination alive without promising outcome. It acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. What endured through this period was not progress, but readiness. The investigation remained positioned for re-examination if conditions changed. Until then, the work continued quietly, defined by careful storage, accurate documentation, and the understanding that time alone does not close unanswered responsibility. Time did not alter the evidence, but it changed what could be done with it. As years passed, forensic science moved forward in ways that reshaped how unresolved violent deaths were approached. Techniques that once required large, clean samples became more sensitive. Laboratories developed methods capable of working with material that had aged, degraded, or been exposed to outdoor conditions. These developments did not rewrite earlier limitations. They created new possibilities. Within law enforcement, these changes prompted review. Agencies began reassessing whether preserved material from older investigations might now be suitable for analysis. This reassessment followed structure rather than impulse. Investigators first confirmed that evidence had been stored properly and that custody records were intact. Without that foundation, no new testing could proceed responsibly. For Herman Wilder's death, this evaluation centered on material that had been preserved since 2001. Investigators consulted forensic specialists to determine whether any items met criteria for modern testing. The decision was not automatic. Testing consumes samples. Once material is altered, it cannot be restored. For that reason, restraint remained essential. Advances in DNA extraction and amplification were central to this reassessment. Newer methods allowed analysts to recover genetic information from much smaller quantities than before. This included trace material that earlier laboratories could not interpret. Improvements in contamination control and validation increased confidence in results, provided procedures were followed precisely. Another change involved DNA databases. Over time, the number of profiles available for comparison expanded significantly. Policies requiring collection following certain convictions increased coverage. This growth improved the likelihood that an unknown profile, if recovered, could be compared meaningfully. Without databases of sufficient size, identification would remain unlikely even if a profile existed. Investigators balanced these developments against caution. They reviewed documentation from the original investigation to understand how evidence had been collected and handled. This context mattered. Forensic results must be interpreted alongside collection conditions to avoid misattribution. Location, handling, and storage history all informed whether testing could produce reliable information. Once forensic specialists agreed that re-examination was appropriate, planning began. Testing protocols were outlined in advance. Quality control measures were identified. Approval was obtained to proceed. The goal was not speed, it was accuracy and defensibility. Laboratory work followed validated standards. Analysts documented each step, from sample preparation to analysis. Controls were used to detect contamination. Results were reviewed internally before being released. This process reflected lessons learned across decades of forensic practice. The outcome differed from earlier attempts. Usable genetic information was recovered from preserved material. This development marked a departure from past conclusions, but it did not yet establish responsibility. A genetic profile is a data point, not an explanation. Investigators understood that association requires verification and context. Confirmation became the next focus. Analysts assessed the quality of the recovered profile and its suitability for comparison. Statistical measures were evaluated. Reproducibility was confirmed through additional testing. Only after this review did the information become actionable. The investigative response remained measured. No assumptions were made about identity or involvement. Instead, the recovered profile was prepared for lawful comparison within approved systems. This step required adherence to legal and procedural safeguards. What changed during this period was not the narrative of the death, but the investigative landscape. Science had reached a point where preserved evidence could be approached differently. Decisions made years earlier to store material carefully now carried renewed significance. This re-examination demonstrated the value of patience within investigative work. Evidence that once offered no direction had not lost relevance. It had waited. The path forward depended on disciplined application of new methods rather than reinterpretation of old facts. For Herman Wilder's death, this stage represented a transition from long-held uncertainty toward renewed inquiry grounded in science. It did not promise outcome. It established possibility. What followed would depend on how that possibility was examined through procedure, verification, and lawful comparison, guided by evidence rather than expectation. With a usable genetic profile confirmed through careful laboratory review, the work moved into a more constrained and deliberate form of inquiry. The information recovered from preserved material was not treated as an answer. It was treated as a reference point that required verification, context, and lawful comparison before it could carry meaning. The profile was prepared for submission to approved DNA databases. This process followed defined rules that governed access, use, and interpretation. Database searches were not open-ended explorations. They were structured comparisons designed to determine whether an unknown profile corresponded with any legally collected records. Investigators understood that a match, if one appeared, would represent a statistical association rather than a conclusion. When the database search produced a potential match, the result triggered additional review rather than immediate action. Forensic analysts examined the strength of the association, focusing on the number of genetic markers and the probability calculations attached to them. These metrics mattered because they defined reliability. Independent verification remained essential. The name associated with the matching profile entered investigative records only after laboratory staff confirmed that the comparison met established thresholds. Even then, investigators did not proceed on identity alone. The next step required alignment between forensic data and documented facts from 2001. Detectives reviewed available records connected to the identified individual. This review focused on verifiable information rather than inference. Employment history, known addresses, and documented movements were examined to determine whether the individual could be placed in the relevant geographic area at the relevant time. The purpose was to test consistency, not to construct narrative. Investigators also returned to original documentation from the discovery site. They reviewed where the preserved item associated with the DNA profile had been found and how it had been handled. Collection notes, storage records, and environmental context were evaluated together. This ensured that the presence of genetic material could not be explained by unrelated contact. Legal standards guided each step forward. A database association alone was not sufficient for attribution. Investigators worked with prosecutors to determine what additional confirmation would be required. This included whether a direct DNA sample could be lawfully obtained for comparison and under what conditions that could occur. Where permitted, confirmatory testing followed. New samples were collected under controlled conditions and compared directly to the recovered profile. Analysts applied the same validation protocols used earlier, including controls and repeat testing. Results were reviewed to confirm consistency across examinations. Only after this confirmation did the identification reach evidentiary reliability. At that point, the genetic association was supported by both database comparison and direct analysis. Investigators documented these findings in detail, including methodology, limitations, and statistical interpretation. Transparency remained central because the evidence would need to withstand scrutiny beyond the laboratory. The identification redirected investigative focus without altering earlier facts. Detectives reviewed additional records connected to the individual, including prior documented interactions with law enforcement and known associations. This review did not extend beyond what could be verified. It served to contextualize the forensic findings rather than explain them. Throughout this process, restraint shaped decision-making. DNA evidence carries weight, but it does not speak for itself. Investigators avoided language that suggested motive or sequence. The focus remained on what the evidence established and what it did not. Association was treated as association, not explanation. Documentation expanded as the investigation advanced. Reports detailed each procedural step, ensuring continuity between laboratory work and investigative action. This record-keeping ensured that later review would reflect process rather than assumption. The identification marked a shift that had not occurred since the initial investigation. For the first time, responsibility could be examined through physical evidence rather than absence. This did not resolve the matter. It clarified where inquiry should be directed within legal boundaries. What followed from identification depended on law and circumstance rather than science alone. The role of investigators was to present verified findings accurately and without embellishment. The role of the legal system would determine what accountability could look like. At this point, the investigation stood on a foundation built over decades. Preserved material, evolving science, and disciplined procedure had converged to produce an identifiable individual connected through evidence. The significance of that connection would be addressed through formal channels guided by statute, documentation, and limits defined by law rather than expectation. As investigators moved forward with verified forensic findings, another constraint became unavoidable. The individual identified through DNA analysis was no longer alive. This fact reshaped what accountability could mean and how authorities could proceed. Science had provided identification, but law defined the boundaries that followed. Confirmation of death required independent verification. Investigators reviewed official records to establish the individual's status. Death certificates, custody histories, and other documented sources were examined to ensure accuracy. This step was essential because any legal action depended on confirmed facts rather than assumption. Once verified, the information was added to the investigative record. The identification of a deceased individual altered the role of prosecutors. Criminal charges require a living defendant. Without that condition, prosecution was not possible. Authorities documented this limitation clearly, distinguishing between identification and adjudication. The distinction mattered. Identification established association through evidence. Adjudication requires a court to weigh proof against a defendant. In this situation, the second step could not occur. Investigators prepared reports that explained this outcome in factual terms. These reports outlined how DNA analysis led to identification and why the legal process could not advance further. The language used avoided implication or narrative framing. It focused on what had been established and what could not proceed under law. Law enforcement agencies coordinated to ensure consistent understanding. Statements were reviewed internally to confirm accuracy and restraint. The goal was clarity rather than resolution. Authorities needed to explain how responsibility had been identified while also explaining why no trial would follow. This balance required careful wording grounded in statute. The preserved evidence retained its significance even without prosecution. It documented association and supported official conclusions. Investigators ensured that all findings were recorded comprehensively, anticipating future review or public inquiry. Transparency remained essential because identification without court proceedings can raise questions if not explained clearly. Family members were informed through appropriate channels. Notifications followed established protocols. Information shared reflected documented findings and legal limitations. Authorities avoided speculation and avoided language suggesting outcomes beyond what evidence supported. The focus remained on accuracy and respect. Public disclosure followed later. When authorities spoke publicly, they emphasized process rather than outcome. They explained how preserved evidence, modern DNA testing, and verification led to identification. They also explained why prosecution was not legally possible. This explanation framed accountability within factual limits rather than emotional terms. Media reporting reflected these statements. Coverage noted the passage of time between the death and identification. Reports emphasized that resolution came through scientific confirmation rather than court judgment. The distinction between knowing who was responsible and being able to prosecute was made explicit. For investigators, this stage required adjustment. Their role shifted from building a prosecutable file to finalizing documentation. Evidence logs, laboratory reports, and investigative summaries were completed to reflect the new status. The investigation moved toward formal closure without trial. The absence of courtroom proceedings did not diminish the importance of the findings. Identification corrected the record. It replaced uncertainty with documented association. Within the justice system, this outcome still carries weight. It establishes truth through evidence, even when law prevents further action. This point in the investigation highlighted the limits of justice systems. Accountability is shaped by both proof and circumstance. When one element is missing, outcomes change. Investigators recognized this reality and approached it with restraint rather than rhetoric. What remained was a record built carefully over years, evidence preserved long enough to be examined, science advanced enough to interpret it, law defined what could follow. Together, these elements produced a conclusion that was factual rather than symbolic. The investigation had reached a place where no further action could occur, not because of uncertainty, but because of finality defined by law. Responsibility had been identified. Legal process had reached its boundary. What followed would be documentation, explanation, and acknowledgement of limits, carried out with the same discipline that had guided the investigation from the beginning. With identification established and legal limits defined, the investigation moved toward formal resolution. This did not involve court proceedings or sentencing. It involved documentation, review, and public explanation. The responsibility of authorities at this point was to close the investigative record accurately and to communicate findings without overstating what law could no longer address. Investigators finalized reports that traced the work from discovery through reexamination. These records outlined how evidence had been preserved, how modern testing was applied, and how verification had been achieved. Each step was described in factual terms, supported by laboratory documentation and custody records. The purpose was not to persuade, but to ensure that the record reflected what had occurred and how conclusions were reached. Supervisory review followed. Agencies examined whether procedures had been followed and whether findings were presented clearly. This review confirmed that the investigation had reached its endpoint within the justice system. There were no remaining actions to pursue. The file could be closed without ambiguity. Public disclosure required careful coordination. Authorities prepared statements that explained the outcome while respecting legal boundaries. They described how DNA testing led to identification and why prosecution could not proceed. The language emphasized process rather than outcome, acknowledging the passage of time without framing it as a resolution in the traditional sense. When information was released, it was presented alongside context. Officials explained that identification and prosecution are distinct outcomes. Identification establishes association through evidence. Prosecution requires a living defendant and judicial process. By clarifying this distinction, authorities aimed to prevent misunderstanding and to set accurate expectations. Media coverage reflected these explanations. Reports summarized the investigative history, noting the length of time between the original death and the announcement. Coverage highlighted advances in forensic science and the role of preserved evidence. Importantly, reporting avoided presenting the outcome as a legal victory. It was described as an evidentiary conclusion reached through documentation and science. For the community, disclosure marked a change from silence to explanation. The investigation, long unresolved in public view, now had an official account. This account did not promise closure or assign punishment. It provided clarity where uncertainty had existed. That distinction shaped how the information was received. Investigators remained measured in public comments. They avoided speculation and avoided framing the findings beyond what evidence supported. This restraint reflected awareness that public disclosure carries responsibility. Misinterpretation can arise when language exceeds facts. Records were archived following disclosure. Evidence remained stored even after closure in accordance with retention policies. Documentation ensured that future review would reflect the same accuracy applied throughout the investigation. Closure did not erase the record. It finalized it. The absence of court proceedings meant that accountability took a different form. Rather than judgment delivered by a jury, accountability was established through verified association and official acknowledgement. This form of resolution carries limitations, but it also carries truth grounded in evidence. The investigation's conclusion demonstrated how institutional processes function when time intervenes. Preservation allowed science to operate later. Science produced information. Law determined what could follow. Public disclosure explained the result without embellishment. By formally closing the investigation and communicating findings responsibly, authorities completed their role. The outcome did not resolve every question, but it replaced uncertainty with documented fact. In doing so, the investigation reached its endpoint through procedure rather than spectacle, leaving a clear record of how responsibility was identified and why the legal system could go no further. After public disclosure, what remained was not an active investigation, but a record shaped by years of restraint and procedure. The work surrounding Herman Wilder's death did not conclude with punishment or courtroom judgment. It concluded with documentation that clarified responsibility within the limits defined by law. This outcome reflected how justice systems operate when time changes what is possible. One of the clearest lessons involved evidence handling. Decisions made in the earliest days carried consequences decades later. Material collected in 2001 had been preserved carefully, even when it offered no immediate answers. That choice allowed later examination without compromising integrity. Preservation did not guarantee resolution. It ensured that resolution remained possible. The investigation also illustrated how forensic science evolves. Methods once considered adequate were later surpassed by more sensitive techniques. This progression did not invalidate earlier work. It explained why earlier testing failed to produce results. Understanding that distinction matters when reviewing unresolved violent deaths. Limitations are often technological rather than procedural. Documentation proved equally critical. Records created during the initial response allowed later investigators to understand context without relying on memory. Photographs, reports, and custody logs provided continuity as personnel changed. Without those records, later analysis would have lacked reference and reliability. Legal boundaries shaped the final outcome. Identification through DNA established association. It did not produce a defendant who could be prosecuted. This distinction defined accountability in this situation. Courts require living defendants. When that condition is absent, justice takes a different form. Acknowledging this boundary prevents false expectations and preserves the credibility of the process. The role of restraint became apparent throughout the investigation. Investigators avoided speculation when evidence did not support conclusions. They resisted premature testing that could have destroyed material. They waited until methods were validated. This patience did not shorten the path to identification, it protected it. Institutional persistence played a role as well. The investigation was not abandoned during inactive years, it was maintained. Files were reviewed, evidence was audited, responsibility was carried quietly. This persistence ensured readiness when conditions changed. Community response reflected the complexity of delayed accountability. Public awareness returned when identification was announced. The information provided clarity rather than closure. It answered a question about responsibility without delivering traditional justice. This distinction matters when considering the impact of such outcomes. The investigation demonstrated how accuracy can outlast urgency. Early years required effort without reward. Later years required patience without certainty. The eventual outcome depended on both. Science provided tools, institutions provided continuity, law defined limits. For law enforcement, the conclusion reinforced the importance of disciplined process. Evidence must be collected carefully, preserved consistently, and revisited only when justified. Documentation must remain accurate regardless of activity level. These practices allow truth to be established even when time intervenes. The record now stands as a factual account rather than a narrative resolution. It shows how responsibility can be identified without prosecution. It shows how evidence can remain relevant across decades. It shows how justice systems operate within constraints rather than ideals. What endures from the investigation is not a sense of finality, but clarity. Herman Wilder's death is no longer defined by uncertainty. It is defined by verified association and documented explanation. That outcome does not resolve loss. It establishes truth through process rather than assumption. In the absence of a courtroom verdict, the investigation's conclusion rests on evidence, science, and law working together as far as they could. The result reflects the limits and strengths of those systems. It demonstrates that accountability does not always arrive in expected forms, but accuracy remains essential, even when time narrows what justice can achieve.